Welcome back, everyone. Today, we are stepping into a question that echoes across thousands of years of human history. A question that has quietly shaped the rise and fall of every great civilization the world has ever known. Why do societies that begin with hope, unity, and ambition so often end the same way? Every civilization starts with an idea. A shared belief that life can be better if people work together. In the earliest stages, survival depends on cooperation. Communities form rules, divide responsibilities, and create systems that reward contribution rather than status. Innovation flourishes not because of luxury, but because it is necessary. New tools, new methods, and new ways of organizing life allow these societies to grow faster than those around them. At this stage, progress feels almost unstoppable. People trust their leaders, believe in their institutions, and share a common sense of purpose. The future appears open and full of promise. Expansion brings confidence, and confidence brings identity. Stories, traditions, and values begin to define who belongs and what the civilization stands for. But within this success lies the first quiet seed of collapse. Growth creates comfort, and comfort slowly changes priorities. The systems designed for survival begin to shift toward control. Innovation becomes tradition, and tradition becomes something that is defended rather than questioned. What once united people around shared effort starts to separate them by roles, status, and influence. This opening phase is not a mistake, it is a pattern. Civilizations do not fail because they grow, but because growth changes what they value. Understanding how this beginning unfolds is the key to understanding why the ending feels so familiar, again and again, throughout history. As civilizations expand, they do not simply become larger, they become more complicated. What once worked for a small, close-knit community begins to strain under the weight of growth. Systems that were designed to manage simple needs now must coordinate vast populations, distant regions, and countless layers of responsibility. Laws multiply, institutions branch out, and administration becomes a world of its own. At first, complexity feels like progress. More rules promise fairness. More departments promise efficiency. More specialists promise stability. But each added layer creates distance between decision makers and everyday life. Problems that were once solved directly now pass through multiple hands, slowing responses and blurring accountability. When something fails, it becomes harder to know who is responsible or whether anyone truly is. Over time, maintaining the system becomes more important than serving the people within it. Resources are spent not on improvement, but on preservation. Effort shifts from solving real problems to managing procedures, paperwork, and internal conflicts. The civilization starts to spend more energy explaining how it works than ensuring that it actually does. This growing complexity also makes societies fragile. A small disruption can ripple outward, triggering unexpected consequences. When systems are tightly interconnected, failure in one area rarely stays contained. Economic strain can lead to political instability. Administrative delays can turn minor issues into major crises. The more complex the structure, the harder it is to adapt quickly. Eventually, the civilization reaches a point where it can no longer simplify without threatening itself. Reform becomes risky, and change feels dangerous. Leaders hesitate, institutions resist adjustment, and the system continues forward on momentum alone. What once supported growth now limits it. Complexity, once a sign of success, quietly becomes a burden, one that the civilization carries long after it can no longer afford to do so. As systems grow more complex, power begins to settle into fewer hands. What starts as leadership for coordination slowly turns into authority for control. Positions meant to serve the collective become permanent, protected, and increasingly distant from the people they affect. Decision-making shifts upward, while ordinary citizens feel their influence fading. This concentration of power reshapes society from the inside. Opportunities that were once open become restricted. Access to resources, education, and protection starts to depend less on contribution and more on proximity to authority. A small group gains the ability to shape rules in its favor, often quietly and gradually, without dramatic changes that would trigger resistance. Inequality does not appear overnight. It grows through small adjustments that seem reasonable on their own. Special exemptions, selective enforcement, and unequal rewards slowly become normalized. Over time, the gap between those who benefit from the system and those who sustain it widens. Trust erodes as people sense that the rules no longer apply equally. This imbalance creates tension beneath the surface. Those at the top grow increasingly invested in preserving their position, while those below feel unheard and constrained. Cooperation weakens as shared identity is replaced by division. The idea of a common future begins to fracture, replaced by competing interests and silent resentment. To maintain stability, those in power often rely on symbolism, tradition, or promises of security. These tools can delay conflict, but they cannot remove its cause. The system appears stable, yet it rests on growing dissatisfaction. When inequality becomes too visible to ignore, unity turns fragile. At this stage, the civilization is no longer moving forward together. It is being pulled in different directions at once. The concentration of power may create short-term order, but it undermines the foundation that once made growth possible. Inequality is not just a social issue, it is a structural weakness that quietly prepares the ground for everything that follows. As inequality deepens, the way a civilization handles its economy begins to change. In its early stages, prosperity comes from creating value-building infrastructure, improving skills, expanding trade, and investing in the future. Growth feels shared, and success depends on innovation and effort. Over time, however, this balance shifts. Economic power increasingly favors those who already have it. Instead of expanding opportunities, the system begins to channel wealth upward. Mechanisms designed to support development are repurposed to secure returns for a narrow group. Profits are prioritized over resilience, and short-term gain becomes more important than long-term stability. This transition is subtle. It often hides behind legal structures, financial complexity, and established norms. To most people, the system appears functional, even prosperous. Yet beneath the surface, productive capacity weakens. Investment in public goods declines, while extraction through fees, rents, and controlled access becomes the dominant economic activity. As a result, the broader population works harder for diminishing returns. Productivity no longer guarantees security. Confidence in the future fades as economic mobility slows. When fewer people benefit from growth, participation declines, and trust in the system erodes further. Resulting imbalance also increases vulnerability. Economies built on extraction depend heavily on stability and constant expansion. When disruption occurs, whether through environmental stress, trade breakdowns, or internal strain, there is little buffer to absorb the shock. What once looked efficient reveals itself as brittle. At this stage, the economy no longer supports the civilization. It drains it. Wealth continues to circulate within a narrow loop, while the foundations that sustain society weaken. The system may still appear successful on the surface, but it has lost its capacity to renew itself. This shift marks a critical turning point, where economic strength becomes an illusion rather than a reality. As economic pressure intensifies, the relationship between civilization and its resources begins to change. Early societies treat land, water, and materials as foundations to be protected, because survival depends on them. Over time, as systems focus more on output than balance, this caution fades. Resources are no longer managed for continuity, but for immediate advantage. Expansion demands more energy, more materials, and faster extraction. Natural limits are pushed aside in favor of growth targets and short-term rewards. What was once considered a warning sign becomes a normal cost of progress. Depletion is delayed by technology or trade, creating the illusion that limits no longer apply. Mismanagement often hides behind complexity. Responsibility is fragmented, and long-term consequences fall outside decision cycles. Environmental strain, infrastructure decay, and reduced resilience build slowly, rarely dramatic enough to demand urgent action. By the time problems become visible, they are deeply embedded in the system. As resources become scarce or unstable, competition increases. Communities that once cooperated now compete for access. Prices rise, systems strain, and inequalities sharpen. Trust weakens as people feel the cost of decisions they never approved. Attempts to secure resources through control or restriction only intensify tension. This stage marks a shift from abundance to pressure. The civilization still functions, but with growing friction. Every part of the system must work harder to maintain the same results. Small disruptions have larger impacts, and recovery takes longer. Resource mismanagement does not cause immediate collapse. Instead, it narrows the margin for error. Flexibility disappears, options shrink, and resilience fades. The civilization continues forward, but now it does so on a thinner foundation, one increasingly vulnerable to forces it can no longer easily absorb or correct. As pressure builds across the system, the role of institutions slowly changes. Organizations created to protect, organize, and serve the population start prioritizing their own survival. Procedures, traditions, and internal hierarchies become more important than outcomes. The institution's existence becomes the goal, rather than the purpose it was meant to fulfill. This shift is rarely intentional. It emerges from layers of rules designed to prevent failure. Over time, flexibility is replaced by caution. Innovation feels risky, while maintaining established processes feels safe. Decisions are guided by precedent instead of effectiveness, and adaptation slows. Institutions grow increasingly disconnected from the people they represent. Feedback loops weaken, and criticism is treated as a threat rather than a signal. When problems arise, the response focuses on protecting structure and authority, not addressing root causes. Responsibility is diffused across departments, making meaningful change difficult. As trust declines, public engagement fades. People follow rules out of necessity, not belief. Compliance replaces cooperation. The gap between official narratives and lived experience widens, creating quiet frustration. Institutions may appear stable, but they rely more on enforcement than legitimacy. This self-preserving behavior also reinforces inequality. Those who understand how institutions work or who benefit from their protection gain advantages, while others struggle to navigate increasingly rigid systems. Access becomes conditional, and fairness feels inconsistent. At this stage, institutions still function, but they no longer evolve. They become heavy, slow, and resistant to reform. What once provided stability now limits responsiveness. The civilization carries these structures forward, unaware that the tools built to sustain it are gradually undermining its ability to adapt to a changing world. When institutions prioritize self-preservation, accountability begins to weaken. Rules still exist, but their enforcement becomes selective. What was once considered unacceptable slowly turns into something expected. Corruption does not arrive as a sudden collapse of values, it spreads quietly, disguised as efficiency, necessity, or tradition. Small compromises set the tone. Exceptions are made for convenience. Favoritism is justified as pragmatism. Over time, these patterns repeat often enough to feel routine. The line between acceptable behavior and abuse of power blurs, and ethical standards shift without formal acknowledgement. People adapt, not because they approve, but because resistance feels costly or pointless. As corruption normalizes, trust erodes at every level. Individuals stop believing that effort alone leads to fair outcomes. Rules appear flexible for some and rigid for others. This perception changes behavior. Participation becomes strategic rather than sincere, and loyalty shifts from shared principles to personal networks. The system continues to function, but with reduced integrity. Decisions are influenced by personal gain rather than collective benefit. Resources are allocated inefficiently, problems are hidden instead of solved, and transparency fades. Those who rely on the system lose confidence, while those who exploit it become increasingly skilled at doing so. Corruption also weakens resilience. When crises emerge, systems built on hidden agreements and informal power struggle to respond openly. Accurate information is delayed or distorted, slowing effective action. The cost of failure grows, yet the ability to correct course shrinks. At this point, the civilization is no longer held together by shared rules, but by habit and inertia. Order exists, but it is fragile. Corruption does not immediately destroy a society, it hollows it out. By the time the damage becomes obvious, the behaviors that caused it are so deeply embedded that removing them feels more dangerous than leaving them in place. As corruption settles into the background, the way a civilization views itself begins to change. Past success becomes a source of certainty rather than reflection. Achievements are no longer seen as results of effort and balance, but as proof of superiority. Confidence hardens into arrogance. The civilization starts to believe its systems are permanent. Traditions are treated as guarantees, not choices. Warnings are dismissed as exaggerations, and critics are labeled disruptive or disloyal. Because the society has endured challenges before, it assumes it always will. Experience replaces vigilance. This mindset reshapes decision-making. Leaders prioritize image over reality, continuity over correction. Evidence that contradicts the official narrative is minimized or ignored. Success stories are repeated, while failures are quietly reframed or forgotten. The gap between appearance and condition widens. Arrogance also affects how change is perceived. Adaptation feels unnecessary, even threatening. New ideas are compared unfavorably to established methods, not on merit, but on familiarity. Innovation slows, and learning becomes selective. The civilization listens mainly to voices that confirm what it already believes. Externally, this attitude increases vulnerability. Other societies evolve, adapt, and challenge assumptions. Internally, resilience declines as flexibility disappears. When conditions shift, responses are delayed, constrained by overconfidence in existing structures. This stage is dangerous because it feels stable. There is no visible crisis, only a growing blindness to risk. The civilization continues forward, convinced of its strength, while its ability to respond weakens. Arrogance does not cause collapse on its own, but it ensures that when pressure finally arrives, the society will meet it unprepared, confident in systems that no longer reflect reality. As internal confidence hardens into complacency, the balance between the civilization and the outside world begins to shift. While attention turns inward, external conditions continue to change. Other societies adapt, compete, and evolve, often more quickly. What once felt distant or manageable gradually becomes more pressing. At the same time, internal unity weakens. Shared identity erodes as inequality, mistrust, and frustration accumulate. Cooperation becomes harder to sustain, and collective action feels increasingly forced. Without strong cohesion, responses to external challenges become fragmented and slow. External pressure does not always arrive as open confrontation. It often appears as economic competition, resource constraints, technological shifts, or cultural influence. These forces test the resilience of the system, exposing weaknesses that were previously hidden. A unified society can absorb such pressure. A divided one cannot. As stress increases, leaders face difficult choices. Without broad support, decisions become cautious or inconsistent. Efforts to project strength may mask uncertainty but fail to address underlying vulnerability. Meanwhile, public confidence continues to decline as outcomes fail to match expectations. This imbalance creates a feedback loop. External pressure amplifies internal tension, and internal division reduces the ability to respond effectively. Small challenges that could have been managed earlier now require disproportionate effort. Recovery becomes slower, and setbacks feel more damaging. At this stage, the civilization still appears intact, but its margins are thin. Stability depends on favorable conditions rather than internal strength. When multiple pressures align, the system struggles to hold itself together. Unity, once the greatest source of resilience, has faded, leaving the civilization exposed at the very moment it needs cohesion the most. Eventually, pressure reaches a point where a crisis becomes unavoidable. It may begin as an economic shock, a resource disruption, a political breakdown, or a sudden external challenge. On the surface, the crisis appears to be the cause of instability. In reality, it is only the moment when long-standing weaknesses can no longer be hidden. Systems that once seemed functional are tested under stress. Procedures slow responses instead of guiding them. Institutions struggle to coordinate. Decision-making becomes reactive, focused on immediate containment rather than meaningful resolution. What worked during stable periods proves ineffective when conditions change rapidly. The crisis exposes contradictions that have existed for years. Promises of fairness clash with visible inequality. Claims of efficiency collide with delays and confusion. Confidence in leadership erodes as messages shift and outcomes disappoint. Public trust, already weakened, declines further as people recognize the gap between narrative and reality. Attempts to manage the situation often rely on temporary measures. Short-term fixes are favored because they preserve familiar structures. These responses may calm symptoms but fail to address underlying causes. Each delay increases strain, reducing the system's ability to recover. Crises also accelerate existing divisions. Groups compete for protection, resources, and influence. Cooperation gives way to self-preservation. The shared sense of purpose that once sustained the civilization becomes difficult to restore under pressure. This stage marks a turning point. The system has not suddenly failed, it has been revealed. The crisis acts as a mirror, reflecting years of accumulated imbalance. How the civilization responds matters, but its options are now limited. The longer problems were ignored, the narrower the path forward becomes. Collapse does not begin with the crisis. It becomes visible through it. As crises intensify, the range of possible responses narrows. Genuine reform requires trust, flexibility, and time, resources the civilization no longer has. Faced with instability, leaders and institutions turn to what feels immediately effective: control. Authority is expanded, rules are tightened, and enforcement becomes the primary tool for maintaining order. This shift is often justified as temporary and necessary. Stability is presented as the highest priority, even if it comes at the expense of participation and openness. Systems focus on suppressing symptoms rather than resolving causes. Dissent is treated as disruption, and disagreement is framed as a threat to unity. Control can create short-term calm, but it weakens long-term resilience. By limiting feedback and discouraging honest evaluation, the system blinds itself further. Information becomes filtered, decisions are insulated from reality, and mistakes repeat without correction. The space for innovation closes just when adaptation is most needed. At the same time, public engagement declines sharply. People comply because they must, not because they believe. Responsibility shifts away from shared effort toward imposed order. This reduces cooperation and increases quiet resistance. The system appears firm, yet it depends increasingly on force rather than legitimacy. Efforts at reform, when attempted, are constrained by fear of destabilization. Changes are superficial, carefully designed not to threaten existing power structures. As a result, underlying problems persist. Each attempt to preserve the system in its current form accelerates its decline. This stage is often misunderstood as strength. In reality, it signals exhaustion. A civilization focused on control has lost confidence in its ability to renew itself. What remains is momentum without direction. The structures still stand, but they no longer evolve. By choosing preservation over transformation, The civilization limits its future and moves closer to an ending it no longer knows how to avoid. In the final stage, collapse is no longer a sudden event but a drawn-out process. The civilization does not disappear overnight. Its structures remain, its symbols persist, and daily life continues in altered form. What changes is function. Systems still exist, but they no longer serve their original purpose. Economic activity slows and becomes unstable. Institutions lose credibility and operate inconsistently. Infrastructure decays faster than it can be repaired. Rules are enforced unevenly, and long-term planning gives way to survival-oriented decisions. The society spends more effort managing decline than building renewal. What makes this stage remarkable is how recognizable it is across history. The details differ, but the sequence repeats. Growth gives way to complexity. Complexity concentrates power. Power erodes trust. Trust weakens cooperation. When pressure arrives, the system cannot respond with unity or flexibility. Collapse follows not because of a single failure, but because correction was delayed too long. People living through this phase rarely describe it as collapse. They experience it as confusion, instability, and loss of certainty. The old order still claims authority, but fewer believe in it. New structures begin to form at the edges, informal and adaptive, filling gaps left by failing systems. Eventually, the civilization transitions into something else. It may fragment, reorganize, or be absorbed by emerging powers. What remains are lessons, artifacts, and stories often misunderstood by those who come later. The pattern is then repeated, shaped by the same human tendencies under different conditions. Collapse is not the opposite of progress. It is part of the same cycle. Civilizations fall the same way because they rise the same way, driven by growth, ambition, and the gradual loss of balance. Until that pattern is recognized and consciously challenged, history continues its quiet repetition, changing faces, changing names, but telling the same story again and again. Looking back across this entire journey, one pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Civilizations do not collapse because of one bad decision, one crisis, or one moment of failure. They decline through a series of choices made gradually, often with good intentions, but without long-term awareness. Each stage builds quietly on the last, until change becomes difficult and correction feels too risky. What makes this pattern so powerful is how human it is. The same instincts that drive growth, ambition, confidence, the desire for order and security also create vulnerability when left unchecked. History is not repeating itself because people forget facts, but because they repeat behaviors. The story of collapse is less about the past and more about understanding the present. By recognizing these patterns, we gain something rare: perspective. Not certainty, not prediction, but awareness. And awareness is the only place where different outcomes can begin. Thank you for taking this journey through history with us. If you found this story thought-provoking, take a moment to reflect, share it with others, and continue questioning the world around you. Until next time, stay curious and we will see you in the next story.